Good morning, I'm Taylor Wilson, and today is Wednesday, May 8th, 2024. This is The Excerpt. Today, we take a look at Stormy Daniels' testimony and Donald Trump's hush money trial, plus the latest from Gaza and how the Department of Homeland Security plans to go after election threats. We have a lot of big breaking stories in today's show, so brace yourselves. We begin with former President Donald Trump. A federal judge yesterday postponed indefinitely his trial on charges he hoarded classified documents after leaving the White House. U.S. District Judge Eileen Cannon ruled that finalizing a trial date without first resolving disputes about classified documents would be imprudent and inconsistent with preparations to present the case to a jury. Meanwhile, Trump's hush money trial continued yesterday in New York, and Stormy Daniels testified. I spoke with USA Today Justice Department correspondent Aisha Bagchi for the latest. Aisha, thanks for hopping on.
Hi, Taylor. Good to be here.
So Aisha, Stormy Daniels, who of course is at the heart of this hush money trial, took the stand yesterday. What did we hear from her testimony?
This was really kind of the most salacious part of the trial that we've heard so far, because Stormy Daniels did get into the sexual encounter that she says she and Donald Trump had in 2006. But first, her testimony started with just her childhood. She talked about growing up in Louisiana in a poor family. Her mom was a single mom from when she was 4 years old, and she talked about her aspirations. She talked about kind of how her life unfolded in getting involved in the adult film industry. And that all led to when she met Donald Trump in 2006 in Lake Tahoe at a golf course, and his bodyguard came up to her and ended up inviting her to dinner. And that led to dinner at a hotel suite, she said. And eventually, after a lot of conversation at the dinner, that led to sex in a bedroom in that hotel suite. But we did also get into the hush money deal. That is really the heart of this case. That occurred about 10 years later after this alleged encounter. Trump does deny the encounter, but Stormy Daniels talked about getting paid $130,000 in 2016 to keep quiet about the alleged affair. And she said this was at a time when she actually did want her story to be known. And then she described how a couple years later, there was a Wall Street Journal article about the hush money deal. And she said that had a really negative impact on her life. But ultimately, she has decided to tell her story. And that has both brought her money and cost her money, is what she had to say.
What did the cross-examination then focus on?
We've only gotten started, so there's probably going to be some more Stormy Daniels testimony later this week. But the cross-examination focused on a couple big things. One was definitely challenging Stormy Daniels' entire story, challenging her credibility, focusing on the fact that she has previously denied that she had this sexual encounter before she told her story that she did have the sexual encounter. And then also hammering in on this idea that she is someone who is motivated by money. The lawyer for Trump, Susan Neckles, was the one cross-examining Stormy Daniels. Neckles seemed to suggest that Daniels got into the adult film industry because she likes to make money. And Neckles suggested that Daniels was just extorting Trump for money in 2016. Daniels responded to that pretty emotionally. She said false, with just emotion in her voice. But definitely that was the line of questioning from the defense. You were extorting money, you're motivated by money, and you cannot be trusted.
Aisha, earlier in the day, Trump's lawyer called for a mistrial at one point. What exactly happened here?
It was actually before the cross-examination of Stormy Daniels even started. It had to do with her testimony earlier in the day. Trump lawyer Todd Blanche said that it's impossible to come back from the things she said. They make an unfair case for Donald Trump, and it's grounds for a mistrial. He said that some of the testimony only had a couple purposes. It was pure embarrassment, and it was to create prejudice in the jury, to inflame them so that they basically wouldn't focus on the things that Todd Blanche said are really the important things to focus on. This is, after all, ultimately a case that's about falsifying business records. Those records, according to prosecutors, were tied to the hush money deal, so that's how it kind of relates back to the story that Stormy Daniels has told about having sex with Trump in 2006. But he really made the point that this case is about something else. And this was way too detailed. This was way too salacious. And he said that aspects of her testimony also raised issues about consent. And he thought that that was really prejudicial. Stormy Daniels said that she didn't feel physically threatened by Trump, during the encounter, but she did also say that there was a power imbalance and that she was aware that he had a bodyguard nearby. But she said she didn't feel physically threatened by him. So it was really a mixed bag in terms of how Daniels described this. Now, Judge Mershon denied that request for a mistrial. He did agree that the Daniels testimony went too far. He said that he thought some of it was not necessary and it went too far. He noted that when the defense raised many objections to aspects of Stormy Daniels' testimony, he did sustain those objections. And then Judge also said that he was surprised that the defense hadn't raised more objections, but ultimately he did not think that the testimony rose to the level of a mistrial. So he let cross-examination get underway.
Fascinating day in court. Aisha Bagshi covers the Justice Department for USA Today. Thank you, Aisha.
Thanks, Taylor.
Israel's military said it took control of the Palestinian side of the Rafah border crossing between Gaza and Egypt yesterday, as leaders vowed to push ahead with a plan to target Hamas in Gaza's southernmost city. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called the military advancement a, quote, very significant step toward destruction of remaining military capabilities of Hamas, unquote. Hamas said in a statement that Israel's incursion sought to undermine ceasefire talks and called on the U.S. and the international community to pressure Israel to halt the escalation. The U.S., meanwhile, has halted a shipment of bombs to Israel, according to a U.S. official, as Washington puts pressure on Israel to avoid a full-scale invasion of Rafah and give more time for ceasefire talks. Those talks are expected to resume in Cairo today. Tension surrounding the Israel-Hamas war set the tone for this year's March of the Living ceremony. The annual event in Poland is held on Holocaust Remembrance Day, commemorating Jewish lives lost during World War II. On Monday, thousands of Jewish people, including Holocaust survivors and some personally affected by Hamas's October 7th attack on Israel, walked through the Auschwitz Nazi German death camp. Just outside the premises, a small group of pro-Palestinian protesters gathered, waving Palestinian flags, according to the Associated Press. More than 1.1 million people were killed at the camp, and altogether, Nazis killed 6 million European Jews during the Holocaust. Stateside, President Joe Biden yesterday spoke at a Holocaust memorial ceremony at the U.S. Capitol.
Never again, simply translated for me, means never forget. Never forget. Never forgetting means we must keep telling the story. We must keep teaching the truth. We must keep teaching our children and our grandchildren. And the truth is, we're at risk of people not knowing the truth.
For more on the ongoing protests nationwide, be sure to tune into the excerpt later today, as my co-host Dana Taylor is joined by NYU Social Studies education professor Robert Cohen to put the current student-led movement into context. You can find the episode right here beginning at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Republican Georgia Governor Brian Kemp signed a bill this week with major changes to how elections are run in the battleground state just months before the presidential election. Kemp's decision was expected given his unique predicament in governing a state whose GOP lawmakers often follow former President Donald Trump. Trump rejects the results of the 2020 election, but Kemp refused to help Trump overturn his defeat in Georgia. Throughout the South, Republican legislatures have been making changes to election laws in response to unfounded allegations of a stolen 2020 election. Georgia's law creates a new process for how counties can remove people's voter registrations from the rolls. The measure also creates new procedures for how homeless people register to vote, requiring them to register at their county elections office, while another part of the bill allows counties in the future to take voters off the rolls if they're registered at non-residential addresses. The ACLU has said this would lead to disenfranchising them. It also allows voters to be removed from voter registration lists up to 45 days before an election. Federal law says states cannot remove people from their voter rolls within 90 days of an election. You can read more with a link in today's show notes. The Department of Homeland Security is preparing for a slew of election threats this year. I spoke with USA Today domestic security correspondent Josh Meyer for more. Josh, thanks for hopping on.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Taylor.
So, Josh, let's just start here. What kinds of election threats are we actually talking about?
There's a broad array of election security threats. Department of Homeland Security is preparing for what they say is a potentially unprecedented array of them. And that includes meddling by foreign governments, bomb threats, lethal letters, including some that were sent recently that had fentanyl in them, intimidation at the polls, and the intentional spreading of disinformation to confuse voters.
Yeah, so what is the Department of Homeland Security planning to do to push back against these threats?
I had an interview with Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, and Mayorkas told me we are dealing with it with intensity. And he said, quote, "The right to vote and the integrity of the right to vote, and therefore of the election itself, is a fundamental element of our democracy." And he added that this is a nonpartisan effort and that they're looking at, a number of things, one of which is having their cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency, which is known as CISA, mobilizing to help state and local election officials bolster their infrastructure against threats. And that's not just physical threats, like intimidation at the polls, but also cybersecurity threats, meddling with elections, trying to hack into servers and so forth.
Josh, will they be working with other departments on these efforts? How do those collaborations work?
Yeah, they're going to be working a lot with state and local officials. They'll work with the FBI too, of course, and even the intelligence communities. But what they're mostly trying to do is leverage the state and local officials because they're really the people on the ground, the front line in this, to help them bolster their defenses. And that ranges from everything from giving them handouts and guidebooks, for lack of a better word, on everything from active shooter responses to intimidation at the polls, to everything from sending people out from their 10 regional offices to look for whether they've been hacked and to give them more hands-on advice.
Josh, the Department of Homeland Security back in 2017 designated the election process as part of the nation's critical infrastructure. I'm curious what led them to take that step and what has it functionally meant in recent years?
They took that step in 2017 after the Russians meddled in the 2016 election. The U.S. intelligence community concluded with a high degree of confidence that Russia was indeed meddling in the election to help Donald Trump and to hurt Hillary Clinton. And so by elevating it to that status, it gives it much more of a high priority. It gives it more funding. It gives it more of a mandate to work with state and local officials to really go after the various threats that are impacting the election, including on the cybersecurity front.
Josh Meyer covers domestic security for USA Today. Thank you, Josh.
My pleasure, Taylor.
TikTok and its Chinese parent company ByteDance have filed a lawsuit in federal court seeking to block a new law that would force the sale or a nationwide ban of the popular app. The petition said the law will, quote, force a shutdown of TikTok by January 19th, 2025, silencing the 170 million Americans who use the platform to communicate in ways that cannot be replicated elsewhere, unquote. The TikTok lawsuit, which challenges the law on constitutional grounds, also cites commercial, technical, and legal hurdles, as well as opposition from Beijing. The Justice Department declined to comment. TikTok filed the petition with a federal appeals court in Washington, D.C. It seeks a court order preventing the U.S. from enforcing the law, which was signed by President Joe Biden less than 2 weeks ago and which passed overwhelmingly in Congress. Biden could extend the January deadline by 3 months. Thanks for listening to The Excerpt. You can get the podcast wherever you get your audio, and if you're on a smart speaker, just ask for The Excerpt. I'm Taylor Wilson, back tomorrow with more of The Excerpt from USA Today.